Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, I'm in a kind of weird space right now. Today's the first anniversary of the day I got my CLL diagnosis, and I've been contemplating that over the last couple of days, sort of build up to it. It's just my thing, anniversaries and stuff like that. But I blathered on about the whole thing this morning in my postcard a day video on YouTube, so I will spare you the faux insights and intimations of mortality and all that bullshit that I got into there. I'll say just that getting accustomed to a new component of my identity in the past year, it's taken some time, but I guess it's helped. It's helped give me a fuller view of what it means to be alive. So that's something. And my health is fine. No updates, nothing weird going on. Cardiologist appointment in a couple of days, but whatever. Instead of all this personal prattling, let's dive into this week's show. And my guest this time is the great cartoonist Howard Chaykin. Howard was on 5 years ago in a barn burner of an episode we recorded during one of my California business trips. So since I was headed back out there a few weeks ago for my first air travel in 2.5 years, I thought I'd check in and see if he was up for round two. In the process of doing that, I discovered that Howard has a really great big project coming out soon, the Time Squared Omnibus. Time Squared is this concept that Howard developed as he was moving away from his best-known project, the comic book American Flag. It was a science fiction version of 1950s Times Square, just replete with robots, the undead, bog monster, lots of sex, jazz, big bands, lantern-jawed protagonist named Maxim Glory, who is a kinetic sculpture artist, and just really stylish, fashionable, and nonlinear in its storytelling, in a really, at the time, advanced way. I say at the time, the first two Time Squared books, both 48-page graphic novels, we'll say, they came out in the 1980s. And so this new project, the Time Squared Omnibus, collects both of those, the prequel sort of intro story from American Flag, and a brand new 48-page conclusion to the whole shebang, as well as a ton of extra material, including art, essays, and other neat behind-the-scenes stuff. So when I saw that the conclusion to Time Squared was finally going to see print, I was even more geeked to sit down with Howard again. The omnibus itself is, supposed to come out last month. It is currently either on a dock in China or making its way by slow boat to the States. The current publication date is August 23rd, 2022 from Image Comics. But Howard was kind enough to send me a PDF of the collection so I could read the finale before we got together. That means I know how Time Squared ends and you don't. But anyway, it's not about the cliffhangery thing or anything like that. It's just the joy of seeing this vision of his come to a culmination, and to see what Howard 35 years later would do in terms of stories set in that same world. So you should go pre-order it from Image or your favorite comic shop or bookshop or wherever the heck else you like to buy books and or comics. Even if you're not a comics geek or fan, whatever, or reader, we'll just say reader. Howard's artwork and what he does with storytelling in all 3 volumes of Time Squared are, they're just amazing to behold. And they were ahead of their time back then. He jokes about that during our conversation, although he knows it's not a joke. It's something that burns his ass. But anyway, beyond bringing Time Squared to a conclusion after a 35-year gap, Howard has been up to a lot in the 5 years since we last got together. including the half of that time being taken up by the pandemic. He has finished the second run of his Romana Clough about the history of the comics industry, Hey Kids Comics. He wrapped up the first series and is now rolling on the next one of his, at the time, controversial series, The Divided States of Hysteria. And he's done a bunch of other work, including some upcoming unnamed projects that he alludes to over the course of our conversation. As ever, any attempt to recap all of Howard's work is going to fall short. Like, I could start giving you a litany of his past work from American Flag onwards, and I'd be missing half of them. And, well, anyway, he's just an absolutely unique and distinct voice in mainstream comics in North America. So if you don't know his work, if you're not a comics person, you're still going to get a lot out of this. And Howard's been a professional comics artist and writer just about as long as I've been alive. And as part of that, he's developed a really thorough and well thought out understanding of comic storytelling that he's tried to share with others in a tutorial called The Paradigm. And that sense of comics as language with its own syntax is something I find fascinating. And seeing someone who's devoted his professional career to making this sort of work, really having a conversation about where that understanding began for him and elucidating what it is. Well, me, that's how we break down and understand the things that we do is critically important to me. That's why I can provide a workflow for everything from making this podcast to how I make my coffee every day. But anyway, beyond all that, it is always fun to gab with somebody who has seen so much history, and in this case, someone who has so many non-comics influences and interests. I could prattle on a lot more about Howard, but if you don't know his work, just ease back, enjoy the conversation. He's a great raconteur. We talk about a lot of non-comic stuff, especially Howard's true passion, which is musical theater. One thing I should mention, while Howard is based out in Southern California, he's going to be here in New Jersey July 9th and 10th for the Garden State Comic Fest in Morristown, New Jersey. That's a mainstream comic show as opposed to the arty stuff I usually go to like TCAF and SPX. But I may just mask up and drop in on Howard and some of his peers who'll be in attendance that weekend. There's more about the event at GardenStateComicFest.com, and I'll have a link to that in the show notes for this one. And July 9th and 10th means 2022 for you time travelers out there. Now, as caveats go, we recorded in person, so there's some noise from neighbors and Howard's dogs, and there were also a few phone interruptions, as well as a couple of bathroom breaks, but I edited around most of those. Here's Howard's bio. Howard Chaykin is a longtime veteran of the comic book business, serving as an artist and writer for nearly every publisher of comics in the past 4 decades and counting. He took the 90s off to work on mostly unwatchable television, so he missed the money and dreck that was comics in that execrable decade. He is responsible, some might say culpable, for introducing a number of previously unexplored themes to comic books. If you're not hip to what that's supposed to mean, there's always Wikipedia. And now, the 2022 Virtual Memories conversation with Howard Chaykin. How's it feel to finish Times Squared?
It was, it's old news now. The book's been finished for well over 2 years. And it was a difficult process to begin because it's a different mindset. And I owe congratulations to my editor, Thomas, who sort of shunted me and shuffled me around to the idea of doing it and to what exactly it was going to be. A lot of it is inspired by Jane Jacobs and her experience with Robert Moses. Yeah. And I've lived in California more than half my life now. But I've often referred to myself as I'm perceived by those around me. I live in a small town now. As a New Yorker on permanent leave. And
that's a kind way of putting it, but go on.
Well, it's the truth, it really is. I'm, Judy Garland's, centennial. I pointed out that for all the great standards that she associated with, one of my favorite things is her version of a lesser known Cole Porter song called I Happen to Like New York. And the only other version I know of it recorded is Bobby Short. And it's a perfect counterpoint. And Times Square is very much about my experiences as a little boy in New York City. I was born in 1950. And one of the things about New York in those first couple of years of my life is that it looked the same way it had since the early 1930s, because the city had been static until post-war America came along and the evolution of new building materials arrived. The Mies van der Rohe's idea and the Bauhaus began to impact itself on the look of the city, and the light of the city changed. When the buildings ceased to be red brick and granite and became glass and steel, the light went from an amber to a cooler blue, almost an aqua, and it changed everything. But my godmother, my maiden aunt, was my conduit to an aspect of entertainment that I had no experience with until she basically took me in hand. She was not quite so eccentric, but my Auntie Mame in that way. Yeah. My parents were sluggards and idiots. The only gift I received from my mother was a deep appreciation of the American popular song. She's why I know who Judy Garland is and why I know Edith Piaf is. But my aunt took me to the theater on a pretty regular basis from the time that I was old enough to be available to such experience, and also to musical theater and to films and to Broadway. And it was the feeling of being a little boy, pre-bar mitzvah, in that world that is inside the book from its beginning, from when I did the first one in the mid '80s to now. Just the experience of living in a heightened realistic New York. I mean, the opening first 20 minutes of a movie called Absolute Beginners.
Julian Temple?
Yeah. The movie itself doesn't interest me particularly, but that opening 20 minutes is amazing. It's a staggering piece of business.
I've never seen it. I've heard it has an incredible tracking shot to kick off the movie. At least it comes up in the player, that Robert Altman movie.
It's astonishing. It's pretty astonishing. The movie itself, my interest flags the minute that sequence is over. But very much like the opening sequence of the downtown sequence in Frank Oz's version of Little Shop of Horrors, Adam Shakeman's version of Hairspray, the musical, Good Morning Baltimore. There's a sense of establishing the geography, both physical and spiritual, of where you are. And that informs so much of what I did with the Times Square stuff, just enormously. And it shows up dramatically in this. I've always liked the concept of Greek choruses. And I don't think I got the concept of the Greek chorus that shows up in the third Times Square as directly or derived from Little Shop of Horrors, but there's a definite link. And the material, the third volume, is more elegiac than the first two. It's about mother and son relationships, which is the bête noire of my entire life. It really is.
Join the club.
Je suis hip, as they say in France. But visually, it required a way of sort of backward-looking thinking, and I'm not sure I achieved it completely, but I'm happy with the results and the outcome. I never expected to make it to 50, so here I am at 71. Careening with luck towards 72. And my skill set is still functional, that I can do work in public that doesn't embarrass me. And I said publicly on an interview I did yesterday that the only other guy of my cohort, my generation, is doing work publicly that's not a parody of itself is Walter Simonson. And I stand by that. And I finished the book 2 years ago. And due to a series of missteps and kerfuffles, all of which are on my side of the table, not on the publisher's, there's been a delay in its publication. It's going back to the late winter, early spring of this year. And we are hopefully getting toward a point of solution to that problem. I can't say when, but I can say with conviction that sooner or later it will come out. I say that sounds like an answered prayer, but I'm hoping. You've seen the book.
Yeah, I've seen the PDF, so I can't wait to see it in print. There are aspects of it that it was fine on screen, but to me, the page and I have a feeling the experience of reading it will be, much richer with a.
You must be really old or something,
Oh yeah, I'm just a crotchety old man. I'm fine with that.
I'm
too.
with you. I mean, I don't read comics on screens. Screens is for screeds, for ranting, and for pornography. And
it does that very well, by the way. Oh, sorry,
all three of those things. I mean, and in one time. I mean, I think a ranting screed that's delivered in pornographic terms seems like a consummation devoutly to be wished. So I'm happy with the work, and it's the finish, the conclusion to an aspect of my work that remains the most personally satisfying of the work. I've never had I've never really understood how to be comfortable and happy by attempting to produce a product that is commercially designed, that is intended to attach itself to the audience's belief system and be okay with it. It just never. And again, this sounds like humble bragging, that awful portmanteau, but there's a truth there. I just, I think my career has demonstrated the fact that I've never had the slightest understanding of how to grab commercial gold. My choices professionally have always been, narcissistic to the extreme. They're to satisfy myself, and if someone likes it, okay, come along, and I'm okay with that. I mean, I one of the reasons I moved to California when I did, I think I mentioned this in the first time we did this together, was that I recognized the fact that I was potentially going to get this old, and I had to do something about it because I had no prospects in comics.
Well, you can just say you were in comics. That equals no prospects. I'm just kidding.
Oh no, that's not true.
Oh yeah,
that really isn't true. I mean, it's true now for guys who came into the business years after I did. But when my cohort came in, there are a number of millionaires.
Yeah, true.
But
let me ask, if Times Squared had been better received commercially, if it was still the work it was, but there was an audience for it at the time, would you have done an album or two every year, or an album every year or two of it?
Probably.
Yeah, I mean, did you envision it at the time as a trilogy, or was it if this works, this will be the universe that I spend?
Oh, I had sketched out concepts for a bi-monthly book.
Okay, so it was something.
Slide Street, which would be yes. I mean, look, the influences on Times Square at its source are, all the film noir I watched as a little boy. On Channel 5 and Channel 9 in New York, and Channel 11 in New York City.
I was going to say, at Channel 11, too.
Yeah, absolutely.
With the Abbott and Costello that we watched, too.
And, I just, Hillary Brooke, Elisha Cooksey, Aubrey Smith, and Roddy McDowell. Also, the musical theater, an enormous aspect of my childhood. And Frank Lesser. Lesser's influence on me as a writer can never be overstated, rather. It's just huge. And then when I became more obsessed with it, the music of, the nightclub music of the 1940s and 50s, is personified by the trios and quartets and quintets of, of Bird, Miles Davis, Dizzy Gillespie, Howard McGee, Don Byas, even, these guys. And visually, an amalgam of all of those influences, all that decorative stuff. While we're watching, I mentioned we watched Pennies from Heaven a couple of nights ago. And while we're watching the movie, I said that, beyond the obvious visual references that are made, mostly in the second half of the picture, to Edward Hopper, the film is deeply informed by the work of Reginald Marsh. And as the film ended, and Alicia Malone, the TCM person, came on, she mentions Hopper and Marsh, and my wife looks at me and goes, "Go no." Look at him. Here he is. And all of that stuff. I mean, I've always had an absolute obsession for the demi-monde of sleaze. And New York had a particular kind of demi-monditude when I was a kid and a teenager in my 20s that I really embraced. I really loved it. I was in my 20s in the 70s in New York City, and, you can't know just how fantastic it was to be that young and that immortal in what was basically a shitstorm in that pre-gentrified New York City.
My mother used to drop me and my brother in an arcade in Times Square while she went to go get the 2-for-1 tickets. And looking back, there's child endangerment, and then it's late 70s pinball arcade. There were guys shooting up in the corner. But okay, whatever. That's New York. We were just too young to get it.
But your mother is obviously of a right mind. I mean, when I tell my grandchildren when they pretended to be interested in my childhood, that brief moment where they faked that shit. That when I was a little boy, I mean, from the time that I was 8 years old, I was traveling the buses and the subways and the ferry boats to my grandma by myself, frequently with my 4-year-old brother. And just no one gave a second thought to it.
Right.
And I'm not saying that,
kids today and parents
and
blah, blah, blah.
That's nonsense. I don't buy into that at all. I think it's just the way we do business adjusts and changes. I mean, I miss child labor, but but I had a job when I was 12. So because I wanted comics. Yeah. And I wanted comics, and no one was going to give me money to get them. So from the time that I was 12, I was delivering bundles for old Jewish and Italian ladies from a laundromat, depending on tips. Frequently ending my workday with a chilled mug of Hires root beer for 12 cents.
And Steve Ditko? Or what era?
No, back then, it was before the Marvel stuff showed up.
Okay.
It was the...
Westerns, romances?
No, it was Julie Schwartz's books.
Okay.
It was Green Lantern, The Flash.
Gotcha.
Not Hawkman, except for anybody who did Hawkman after Joe Kubert. It's not canon. It doesn't really work. It's, those 6 issues of Raven Bold that Kubert did are apocal in their brilliance. I mean, they really are. And the Flash, Green Lantern, and then later the Atom. And then I discovered Golden Age stuff, and it was like, oh my God, it was like a window into another life, another world. And I really loved that window. I have an aversion, we talk about these kids today. The one aspect of contemporary culture, among many, that I find most appalling is the kind of contemporary chauvinism. A belief that this Panglossian belief that the way we are now is the best of all possible worlds and that we can look back on the world. And I'm a member of a kind of a shambling, incoherent fellowship of men and women, one of the tenets of which is we will not regret the past nor wish to shut the door on it. And I realize we are living in a moment in history where the regret of the past and the shutting the door on it and the adjustment of history to serve our own personal conventional convictions is endangering to the truth of understanding the value of history. And the bizarre contradictory combination of defining American society as eternally white supremacist and yet being completely entertained by fabulisms of depictions of 18th and 19th century and 20th century drama in which women, blacks, Jews, or other people of color have authority over white people seems to perfectly satisfy an audience that objects to white supremacy in its existence, which seems somewhat, credulous and fatuous making, but it also demonstrates its fact how easily an audience can be manipulated into believing anything it wants to believe.
As we were talking about someone else who we won't mention on mic, ideological incoherence.
Yes,
really does kind of dominate. I'll tell you guys afterwards. But yeah,
just
it really does.
It, and it'll be okay. Like your mom did.
Yeah, it does sort of dominate the mentality when it comes to pop culture versus, again, it's well, we can go on about the roots and, like I'd mentioned, only seeing The Third Man a couple of years ago for the first time and realizing, oh, that's where every movie I like gets all of its major themes
But one must never forget the fact of how much Carol Reed copped from Anthony Mann.
Yeah, and again, that's my thing. Whenever you find the root, there's somebody else came before.
Anthony Mann is the uncredited director of a movie called He Walked by Night.
Yeah.
Which is the unofficial pilot for Dragnet. Jack Webb has a small part in the picture playing a forensic scientist with bearing no resemblance whatsoever to Joe Friday. And the two cops are, one of them is Ray Teal, who always played bad guy cowboys and ended up being the captain on Oh Susanna with Gail Storm. And it's very much that late 40s post Mark Hellinger, post Jules Dassin on location shooting. And Richard Basehart plays a serial killer, and there's an entire sequence of pursuit in the sewers, which Reed lifts cold for The Third Man. But for me, what I love about The Third Man more than anything else is Joseph Cotton's brilliant portrayal of banality. He's just, as I said, I've got it queued up on my DVR. I've seen it. Most of my movie going, the way we saw these pictures was on 9-inch yellow plastic Panasonic black and white portables, which we had jury rigged to our drawing tables in the 1970s. Everybody, we all did. Me, Walter, and Gil Kane. I mean, I saw CoverGirl for the first time watching it on one of those 9-inch portables as he annotated the movie for me. Yeah, which is one of the greatest professional experiences I've ever had. It had nothing to do with drawing, but it made me understand movement in space through his depiction of Gene Kelly as an urban cavalier as opposed to a dandy in Fred Astaire's case, and seeing these movies many times for the first time in 50 some odd years, finding out that many of them were in color. I had no idea, no clue. I was stunned to find out the CoverGirl was in Technicolor. My God, it's fantastic. Rita Hayworth. So we've spent the past 3 years catching up from my wife, who, as I said earlier, had never seen anything. When I see pictures of her from her teenage years, she looks like a Mormon. She was not, but she certainly played one on television. But she has no context for rock and roll, for television fandom, for movie fandom.
Before we started the conversation, you mentioned something about people being Soviet sleeper agents.
Yes.
Have you looked into that?
I'm going with Mormon.
Okay, because I had to admit on a recent show that I'm the only guy who was an American teen in the 80s who never saw The Breakfast Club, and I'm pretty sure this is what's going to get me tagged when they they finally have the, wait a second, how can, he's got to be a spy. That's
Okay, we took a break here for a bit, and when we came back, we went on some digressions about TV and actors that I can't actually include in the episode, which is really disappointing because there was some great stuff about Elmore Leonard in there, but sorry. But now, back to your regularly scheduled conversation where we were just talking about Adam Devine.
My grandchildren, all of them have now officially outgrown Caillou. So they now look back on their Caillou experience as children with disgust. Because Caillou is just one of the worst things ever that happened to grown men and women when they went to watch it with their child. It's just awful. But one of the best things is my grandchildren turning on something called Uncle Grandpa, which is this absolutely batshit cartoon. Just insane. The lead character looks sort of like he's drawn by a guy who can do a Don Martin head in his Hebrew school homework. The flying tiger is basically a cutout photograph of a tiger with flames coming out of his ass. And Pizza Steve is a narcissistic slice of pizza, played by Adam Devine, wearing sunglasses. Pizza Steve!
Okay.
And it's just, for the kids!
I'm hoping that kids end up, demented and weird the way we had,
look,
we had our own stretches.
I have the utmost faith.
Yeah. So we'll get back to it, though.
Sorry about that. I'm the Pope of digression.
No worries. So the question, though, with this version of Times Squared, or this final iteration, returning to the book, again, you finished a couple of years ago, but your approach to storytelling, do you see, how did it change, I guess, from those first two that you did to the way you approach this one? And you mentioned how the subject matter itself is different than what you were doing. But did the storytelling change? And in ways that you might not have been able to do back in the 80s?
Probably. I think that's fair. I mean, I become much more of a formalist. I don't subscribe to the previous generation of cartoonists who dismiss mine for our attempts to jazz up the look of the page. And my layouts are still odd, but they're more formalized than they were back then. And that's the result of, I think of just, reaching a point where I no longer have the desperate need to be abstract. And the lesson I learned from the reception that Times Square got was that the audience was not willing to follow me in ways that I might have hoped they would. There's a monograph about Times Squared, which is titled "Howard Chaykin and the Overestimation of the Audience," and I've come to realize that to a certain. I mean, and again, it is incredibly insulting, and I apologize to those of you out there who are insulted. It really is. The apology really isn't.
He's very half-hearted. I mean, if this is on video, you would just be Anyway,
it's dismissive and condescending, and it's rife with scorn. the fact is, I love the medium of comic books. I'm a comic book man. But the lesson I learned from doing Hey Kids Comics is just how much the audience itself was infantilized by the comics code along with the product. That the interest in actually challenging material as opposed to challenging adjacent and ersatz edginess and crypto maturity as it's been imposed on children's material is, to me, the great flaw in the work we do. And I consider myself a mainstream guy. I mean, I'm not interested in the kind of comic books and comic strips that are done by the academics who feel the need to define what they do as graphic noveling. Graphic novels is something that is comparable to people who are in film studies who can't call films movies, but need to call them cinema. And I mean, anecdotally, a few years back, I was at a convention in South America, in Buenos Aires, and the only other mainstream guy backed out the day before the show started. So I was left alone, surrounded by a cadre of people whose heads only occasionally saw sunlight because they were so firmly shoved up Art Spiegelman's ass. And the condescension was palpable. I mean, it was just absolutely astonishing to me, because these people are as guilty as most of contempt prior to investigation. So they presumed that I was making my living drawing Wolverine comic books. And the surprise at that I was functionally fluent in Spanish, that my accent in Spanish was completely was indistinguishable from theirs, that like Germans, I don't speak Spanish with a German accent, that I was able to understand and completely reject being discussed condescendingly by a couple across the way from me at dinner table, my wife having no idea what was going on. I was treated as like I was a talking dog. It wasn't so much what I said, but the fact that I could talk at all was a real shock. Yeah. And the insulting condescension of this crowd, from people who encourage a belief system that comics is a found art, thank you, Robert Lichtenstein, or that it is something that is a casual, instinctual, professional experience that requires no understanding of the syntax or vocabulary, just drives me up the fucking wall. You know, for all, I mean, Spiegelman's monograph about Master Race is a brilliant piece of writing. It really is. And it demonstrates an understanding of the craft that runs very deep. And his appreciation of Kurtzman is also equally brilliant. But he is also encouraged, by dint of his own experience, an entire swarm of people who wake up on Saturday morning and decide, I think I'm going to be a graphic novelist today. Just sort of, whatever. It's like all those women who married rich and decided one morning that they were interior decorators. And I reject this out of hand. So much, to answer your question, so much of what informs the graphic nature of the third volume of Times Squared is the evolution of an understanding of that language, that syntax, that vocabulary. That idea that there's a pattern available, that there's a reason why this picture is of this shape and this size, what images of narrative value means, what that really means. As subjective as it is, but it has value. It has real meaning. Yeah, I watched a video you had done, the Paradigm video a month or so ago, talking about comics as a visual language and the page as a unit. Right. And it reminded me, going into that academic arts comics sort of circle, Frank Santoro, cartoonist out of Pittsburgh, saw him doing a presentation once, or actually he was on a panel, but very much focused on the page as unit and understanding the flow and why the panels are where they are. When I was doing the Marvel seminar, the irony of the Marvel seminar is that I'm certainly not a star in the comic book business. I'm an obnoxious legend, and they would bring in somebody who was a very commercial player at one of the days, and the guy they brought in is someone I admire enormously, truly. He's a terrific guy. He's a political troglodyte, but he's also one of the best artists working in comics. We're collaborating on a job right now. I'm having dinner with him in Connecticut to put the full court press to finish the fucking job already. Get with it. Finish these pages. They're gorgeous. Let's get it done. It's phenomenal. Yeah. And his idea about storytelling was completely antithetical to what I was saying. And I felt that he was there, he could listen, but as soon as he left the room, I completely contradicted everything. Because I said that what he was talking about was something that is instinctual to him, that is not a learned experience. Mm-hmm. And a learned experience is what I have, because I have no talent. And I'm talent-free in the conventionally identifiable talent sense. Like Bernie Wrightson was talented.
Yeah.
You know, I'm a guy who recognized my limitations and figured out first how to make assets of my liabilities, and then ultimately to convert that rage into a controlled and governed understanding of how to apply knowledge and actual skill sets to learn how to do this. And it wasn't until years later that I realized that Gil Kane had gone through precisely the same thing. It had been so organic in my experience of watching his work evolve that when I saw the work that he did for Simon and Kirby, when he was ghosting Jack stuff on Newsboy Legion or Boy Commandos, it was terrible. It was better than I was. But
it wasn't Gil Kane.
Oh, it sucked. It sucked a lot less than I did, but it sucked. It was terrible. And he really self-educated. And so his autodidacticism was enacted both in the same way as mine, which is to say, learning craft, learning skill sets, and learning critical thinking.
Yeah, and it's that third part where I wonder when do you feel you put together that understanding of the syntax of comics? When did it become a visual language for you? That not that it was a formula or anything, but that you understood what you were doing.
Probably when I came back to comics in 2002 on a full-time basis. Because Flag was a learning process. Times Squared was a part of that process. Black Kiss was a bit more formalized, mostly because of the absence of color.
Yeah.
When you work without color, you have to depend much more on the formalized principles of what you put down in the first place. And then I left, and I worked in television for 12 years straight, without any real involvement in the comic. I missed most of the 90s. And to a certain extent, the upside.
And let me tell you, I think we both win for that. I also, that's just when I quit superheroes and moved into the indie stuff. Like, I missed all the Image stuff. I missed all anyway, go on.
But the fact is, the audience turned over and didn't know who I was when I came back.
Yeah.
But when I came back to do comics in the early aughts, I discovered, that my skill set was in great shape. But more importantly, I had developed a capacity for improvisation. I didn't necessarily know that I was able to do something when I chose to do it. Mm-hmm. And that courage had never existed in me before. I'd always lived in a very narrow confine. And I began to look at principles, at formalizing principles that had been sort of gestating and floating around my head. About a year or so, well, a couple more than that. Everything's a couple of years ago now. Of course, it's more than that. But somebody posted a series of tableau of Hitchcock shots, framing shots. And this guy's a screenwriter. He says, nobody does this anymore. And I said, I do. And I realized at that point how much of the way I structure comic book pages and panels themselves is based on the tableau of CinemaScope, the placement of figures in space. If you remember that paradigm stuff, the page that I've said more than once that in comic book space represents time, and that the amount of space allotted to an image is directly related to the amount of time involved in the action taken for that image. And the page is very much that a whole piece of that time. And the page is also very small. It's really tiny. Yeah. When I tell people that the third part of the paradigm lecture, Paradigm in Practice, I point out that you can get all the information you need on a page in 2 sentences on an index card. And if you're doing more, you're asking more of the page than the page can deliver. The real estate is not there.
Yes, this reminds me of about a year after you and I recorded. In fact, we met the following year when you were at a festival in New Jersey. Around that, I recorded with David Lloyd, the guy who drew V for Vendetta with Moore, and asked him, so way back then was Moore doing those incredibly hyper-written scripts? He said, I would have killed Alan if he gave me anything like that. He gave me a couple of sentences, and I'm the artist. I'm going to make these pages.
No, I mean,
that's yeah.
They're insufferable. They're impossible. They are a struggle to read. They are completely. They feel as. I mean, they turn out brilliantly. They're fine, but they're a chore and a challenge.
Right.
And I did once and never again. And I promised myself I wouldn't work with another writer again until I got something to do in one this past year. Working with a writer I really like. There are two guys working in comics. I've said this publicly before. In mainstream comics, Mark Waid and Mark Guggenheim, who I did this job with, who have whether an innate, instinctual, or intellectual understanding of the real estate of the page that is comparable to mine. They call out shots entirely differently than I do, but their understanding and expectation of what a page can give them is comparable to my understanding of that space. Too many writers have this idea that the lettering, the visual elements are simply there as visual support to their text, when the truth is the inverse. That the job of the comic book writer is to take literary ideas and translate them into images of narrative value, to make pictures that have context that in themselves are storytelling. The way you frame a shot, that the 22 panels of Wallace Wood, we mock them, we think about them. They're sort of like they're when boring writers, But the truth is, those panels are filled with narrative value. The way a character frames another character, the vignette nature, the air and space around the vignette, the not objectifying the panel board being a mechanical construction which has no context for the action and context in the image. Acknowledging that panel border, for me at least, eliminates the sense of deep space and also the sense of separateness from our world. I had a back and forth exchange this morning with my Italian publisher about a remark I'd made about the relationship between comic books and the stage and musical theater.
Which is one of my questions I was going to ask you.
Let's get to it.
What did you learn about comics and storytelling from musical theater?
That tableau, that idea of the tableau. Yeah. I mean, and also the proscenium arch. I saw my first musical when I was 13 at the first season of Lincoln Center. It was either the King and I or Carousel. I forget whichever was the first. It was they did these in those days they did bus and truck shows. They would do a month's worth of work in New York and basically work at the Kinks and then load everything up into a tour bus and a truck to carry the sets. My wife ended up seeing the same shows that I saw out here at various performing arts venues up in Northridge in the North Valley, and I was struck by the engineering mechanics of narrative, and then in later years, the flamboyance of musicals, the fact of the existence of a proscenium arch like a panel border, the use of flies, the use of flats, the breaking into song. Simonson and I, two of the smartasses in comics, would frequently talk about what we were doing, because the more you talked about it, the deeper one's understanding of it became. I mean, and I abjure the idea of this being a natural function. That it's as I say, it's got a vocabulary, it's got a syntax. And Walter always said, and rightfully so, that fights in superhero comic books are outward demonstrations of inner trauma, and they have a direct relationship to people bursting into song in musical theater.
Yeah.
I have absolutely no problem with the Willie's suspension of disbelief in terms of musical theater. And it took me years to understand that I don't hate movie musicals as much as I thought I did. I read Janine Bassinger's book about movie musical, which is a great read, by the way. She is one of my two favorite contemporary living writers about movies. The other one being, of course, David Thompson, who is, as much as I disagree with him on so many things.
We got to record in January. That was another one. We talked about some of those high point ones for me. That was holy fuck, this is David Thompson. We're actually riffing here.
I love this guy. He should be Jewish.
Yeah,
He really
he's an honorary.
And Basker's book really convinced me that I hated him much less than I thought. But what I realized was that it's the narrative aspect of movie musicals that I don't particularly go for. That for the most part, the isolated sequences of musical performance are transcended. But the narrative linkages between those musical
They have to frame it too much.
You know, one of the things we watched a lot of the Estate of Rogers pictures in the beginning, and we both became very bored with them. And we realized, let's just watch this on YouTube. And we ended up watching bits. We did a whole night of Fosse bits.
Yeah.
You know, of his movie appearances. And there's a sequence in Hey Kids Comics where the Gil Kane avatar, Ray Clark, is demoted from the Army, and he goes to see Oklahoma in its third year on Broadway. And I don't know if Gil ever saw Oklahoma. He was he talked at great length about seeing Marlon Brando in Streetcar, you know, for 60 cents. You know? But I have him being completely enraptured by Agnes de Mille's work. Anecdotally, years ago, Bob Fosse was brutally furious at Michael Bennett's success with Chorus Line. And he tried to do his own version called Dancing, which was basically him tweaking choreography by those choreographers who'd influenced him. And they did Rodeo, the Aaron Copland piece. And I've always sat in the front row mezzanine. That's where my seats are in theater, particularly for musicals.
Yeah.
I like to be above the stage. Okay. And my wife and I were sitting and watching this, and we turned to each other and at one point as the cowboys were working, and they were suspended in midair. And we pulled them and we said, "Oh, look, it's Gil Kane drawing." You know? and that's really where it's at. I mean, to a profound extent. And I haven't got the skill set for it. When I do choreography, Gil's fighting choreography is so clearly influenced by musical theater and musical films. The use of deep space, you know, the hyperbolic nature of it derives from there. For me, what I derive from that again, it's that tableau, it's that the aspect ratio of the stage.
Yeah.
A couple months ago, I went up to Santa Paula to see a play written and directed by a colleague of mine, a guy who I'd met when he was a second unit AD on a show that I did. And I was a new story editor. And I ended up hiring him as a writer on the last show that I worked on. And I was expecting a table reading. What was a stage reading. And it was phenomenal. And I was impressed by the fact of his blocking of a single set. And so much of what I do is about that stage blocking. You know, I recently saw a couple of covers by Ross Andrew and Mike Esposito. The audience of your generation identifies him as a Spider-Man artist. And
with the Spider-Mobile, too. I know.
But I was
6.
Well, but
yeah.
I grew up loving the work that the two of them did on Wonder Woman with Kanigher before I met Kanigher and discovered what kind of fucking asshole he was. But I loved it. It was just batshit comics. And it was Gil Kane who by the time I become of an age, Ross Andrew, but Gil would say, "Look at this shit," you know. And I've gotten to look at the work that he was doing in the 50s when he and Mike were partnered up trying to do their own comic book company. And their mad knockoff, Get Lost, was I think the most visually successful of all of the imitators. I found out recently that I said that they would have been perfect fits for Kurtzman or even Feldstein. And apparently Gaines made a fiat, they will never work for me. And but I also saw a couple of romance covers they've done. I've never seen the interiors, but these covers are they're the antithesis of what we think of as romance comics covers. We think of romance comics as clinches with someone in the back, you know, my heart is broken. These were tableau, full figures with vignetted sets, you know, a sofa, door, things like this. And they were brilliant. They were just phenomenal. They were really reflective of magazine illustration of the time in a different way, but in the same way that Alex Toth's splash pages for the romance comics he did for Standard back then really reflected an influence of the work of guys like Al Parker and Kobe Whitmore. Speaking of which, there's a Kobe Whitmore and there's an Al Parker. Right?
I'm glad we're recording upstairs this time because I get to see all of the art that you got.
There's your Parker, there's your Whitmore, you know, things like that. So that really informs me, and the vignetting of it all, trying to explain to my digital assistants what a vignette means in this context. You know, it's kind of like when you go to the theater, there's, you know, I used to get into arguments with colleagues of mine that said the theater was less realistic than movies. And when I finally began to understand what they meant, when they said realistic, they meant verisimilitude. Theater is far more engaging for me than film, and I'm deeply engaged. I'm a big weeper. I cry at everything. The Nutrisystem commercials burst me out, So, but when in theater, the physical presence of acting, the no net, really appeals to me enormously. Years ago, well over 20 years ago, we saw a production of the Heiress at the Omnibus Theater, which is a vast house, and it was a great cast: Cherry Jones, Michael Comsty, and Frances Sternhagen played the old maid aunt. And she took a spill down the stairs on the set. The show was shot for 45 minutes. And when they came back on stage and she was fine, everything else, the rush of the reality of blood and performance really informed the remainder of the show. It was fantastic. It really was. Not to say that, of course, that Cherry Jones isn't a fucking force of nature on stage as it is, but
the occasional bloodlust. I'm just kidding. The immediacy though of these are people in a moment.
There's a viscera.
Yeah, there's not an extra take
you can
do.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
When I met my wife, I took her. She asked to come visit the set. She'd never been to a set. She couldn't get away from it fast enough. It is so fucking boring. It is so airless and arid. Yeah. When you're shooting a television series, you're shooting moments, you're shooting elements, you're shooting bits of business. There's very little electricity. All the electricity is in the editing room, and so the stage is where it's at. I mean, one of the great frustrations from my own narcissism and solipsism because of the lockdown is when the lockdown took place, I had tickets to see a whole bunch of shit in New York, which is all canceled. And I've had tickets to see a whole bunch of other stuff since then. Then we just had to cancel the show, cancel performances, cancel the trips, rather. And now I'm paranoid about booking shows in New York because they seem to be canceling performances left and right. I just found out that Rob McClure's the production of Mrs. Doubtfire had not really caught traction. That closed. He's moving in to take over the part of Seymour in the West Side Theater's production of Little Shop of Horrors, which is a phenomenal production.
Yeah,
tiny. It's a recreation of the original off-Broadway production. 7 actors, and just Tammy Blanchard. Tammy Blanchard is the woman who played the young Judy Garland in that TV movie where Judy Hayes played as an older woman. Yeah. Blanchard I saw her as Gypsy Rose Lee. And she was a phenomenal Gypsy Rose Lee, opposite Bernadette Peters as Rose.
When did you feel comfortable going back to the theater?
When or would I?
When? Or have you?
Not yet.
Oh, okay. No. I have not gone to a movie.
We go to the movies on Monday mornings. Yeah. When the only other people there are really old people who sit far away from us. And
getting on a plane yesterday was as I've said, my first time in 28 months, and that was weird, but weird. Just okay.
You had a pod, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was isolated, but it was still.
It's an airplane.
You got to be at an airport. Mm. You got to be around people.
Well, but you have physical issues that I don't, and also I'm much more sanguine about dying.
Oh, I'm fine with that part of it. It's more like getting other people sick too when I come back and potentially killing people.
Well, but again, if you can only choose.
Yeah, I know. I've left a mark saying this was from Gil.
I've got a shit list. Yeah. I truly do. I hold, as I've said more than once, I hold a grudge like a bloodstain on silk.
Let me ask. You mentioned the word once when we were talking earlier. Do you think about being happy?
Yeah, I am happy.
Yeah?
Yeah, I am.
Okay. I wasn't sure if the I don't want to say facade, but the outward facing, rage and everything else. I mean, that's a thing, but
no, I'm very content.
Yeah,
I really am. I mean, I'm smugly content with having created my own reality and living in it. I come from a background of such disenfranchisement, of so toxic a mindset, that distancing myself from that toxicity and unlearning the habits and traits that informed that toxicity. Someone asked me whether I was happy some years back, and I said I am content. And I had to explain that someone with my appetite and my hunger cannot afford ecstasy.
That's what I'm wondering. There is a difference between content and happy, and I was wondering whether happy is a...
Well, I have a phenomenal life. I do exactly what I want. I answer to no one. Actually, I take it back. The only person I answer to, I pay to be answerable to.
Yeah.
You know, because I believe that you need an accountability and availability in your adult life. The profligacy that informed my experience until my early 40s has left me. I'm no longer a reckless person. I function carefully. When I am reckless, it's always a reminder of that profligacy. And yeah, I mean, there's, you know, I've said more than once recently that there are three ages of man. You know, we are a buyer in a seller's market. We are a buyer in a buyer's market. And then we are disappointment to everyone we've ever known or will ever meet. And I'm in that disappointment stage right now. And I don't really care very much. I have nothing to prove. I am always disappointed to find out that people I loathe and despise me almost as much as I hate them. And I think they should not know. It should be a surprise to them. Let's have that moment.
It was years ago I discovered I was someone's nemesis.
Really?
I had no idea. I thought I'd been skating through my professional life, no big deal. And
you seem likable.
And then discovered, someone in my industry really, really detested me. And I thought, I've earned it. But I was like, really? I achieved that level of disgust, that I was their particular nemesis as opposed to just an irritant. But yeah.
Jim McLaughlin published his piece last week about the writers as alpha in comics, and I'm quoted extensively.
Oh yeah, I read that.
And someone said, despite the presence of Howard Chaykin here, this is worth reading. And I'm like, wow, that's fantastic. It means I'm having an effect, in some form or another. I just, I'm not lovable. I understand that, and I'm not particularly likable, but I'm fun. That's just,
you give good quote.
Look, it's, I had no clue at any time in my life that I would ever be able to achieve the level of grace that I have achieved in my life. It's astonishing me that I'm this old, that I have this much clarity, and that I have no particular assumption about my sense of self, my mindset, my belief systems as demonstrating anything even vaguely resembling moral clarity or virtue. I am who I am, as Alban says or he says what I am in La Cage aux Folles. Speaking of musical theater, a great production by the Donmar Company, by the way.
Yeah.
Donmar, miniature, very tiny. I guess I am. I am content, and I am frequently happy, but I'm rarely delighted.
Okay, so we'll keep that on a gradient. I guess.
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
I'm so much of my recklessness before I stopped drinking and using drugs was based on seeking a state of ecstasy, and that made me an untrustworthy person to deal with. And in the 30 years since that time, I've become trustworthy and honorable and reliable. And those things matter to me. We live we're living in the world in the most potentially slow motion apocalypse I've ever could have imagined. And we're witnessing with the potential collapse of Western civilization as we've known it for most of our adult lives. And I'm grateful for the fact that I'm old enough to remember what once was, and that I won't be around for what's coming. But in the meantime, being a gadfly is very satisfying. It really is. Because I'm someone, I told you this. In the same day, I was referred to as a demon in a human skin suit by a talent-free trans artist who felt I was in no way allowed to depict a trans character in any way other than by their depiction. And on the same day, I was referred to as a neutered butler of the social justice warrior movement by someone on the other side of the trough.
Yeah.
And progressives in the United States, who have become a kind of a secular religion unto themselves, perceive anyone who doesn't agree with them in every punchboard, checklist qualification as a fascist or as a lost cause, an unforgivable lost cause. Whereas the right wing regards that person as a potential ally. And they're both wrong. They can both go fuck themselves.
It's one of those questions. I think it came up after we recorded when you had the, we'll just say, controversy with the cover from that Divided States of Hysteria. And I did a show during the pandemic, so it must have been late 2020, with Judy Gold, the comedian, about her book, Yes, I Can Say That, and what comedians can and can't say. Yeah, what social codes, et cetera, dictate about that. Looks like we're being censored.
Is that this? All right, keep talking. No,
it sounded like it was there. But, I mean, it's your coffee machine.
Oh, it's my coffee telling me that it's no longer coffee.
Yeah, which I think we've now agreed is for the best.
Yeah. Thank you very much, you patronizing fuck.
But do you get that sense of what you can and can't say? Has that changed, what you can and can't depict?
I think can is, let's just say should.
Should.
Do
you feel more sensitive, or do you feel the quote-unquote reading public is...
I don't care. Look, I haven't cared whatsoever what their commercial interests were since I became who I am.
Sure.
So I really can't become completely obsessed with anticipating other people's reactions and feelings. When I moved to California, one of the things I didn't know how to drive for the first 2 years I lived here. I didn't learn to drive until I was 37. And what happened was I realized that I couldn't walk out of my house and turn out, make a right turn and find a newsstand. So I subscribed to everything, and I subscribed to everything. I was on, I subscribed to, on one end the Nation, now the Baffler, and on the other end, the Washington Spectator, just all the National Review.
Yeah.
I read everything because I believed it was my responsibility to read everything. I just do, So I'm assuming I'm on a lot of FBI lists for odd controversial reasons. But as an adult, as a man of my age and my time, I recognize the fact that ideological incoherence I mentioned earlier is a real issue. The ad hominem attacks on me personally, based on the scrim and filter of misperception, is a source of my condescension, my scorn, and my spite.
Yeah.
Because if you don't bother to find out what it is about someone you don't like and confirm your distaste, that if you're just as happy with the beginning of that idea as opposed to the conclusion of the experience, you're not worthy of my attention. I was at a convention a couple of years back in Raleigh-Durham, a town I really like, by the way. It's really good. I mean, I had a great time. They have really good pizza.
I'm in northern New Jersey. I don't need to go anywhere for good pizza, but I understand. I appreciate it.
There's a place called Gino's across the street from the convention center in Durham.
Yeah.
Run by a guy born in Little Neck, New Jersey.
Okay. So he brought
Wait, no. Okay. Little Neck grew up in Naples. Everything else on the menu sucks at dick. It's disgusting. I mean, really awful. It's a wet mess. His pizza is fucking world class. It's staggering. Went there 3 nights in a row. It was really, and we thought it was just going to be fuel. It was like really good. And anyway, and I rented these two fans who were really confrontational. And I sort of set them up. I said, "Why do you believe this? Why do you believe this?" And and now of course they're on me all the time. I'm in touch with them on a regular basis. Because they came to realize that they had their belief system was based on happenstance and hearsay. 5 minutes after I met them, these two little girls, young girls, 18, 19, college freshmen, basically spent an hour explaining to me where I had gone wrong. Yeah. And I was fascinated by it. It was just an absolute. It was a perfect example of an isolated culture, of a belief system that had been fermented in a petri dish, extent of experience. And that lack of experience, I believe, informs so much of contemporary culture's mistaking chastity for virtue and prissiness for moral clarity. The fact that people don't go on dates anymore, that they date in groups, that if they don't do that, they meet each other online without being physical, that there's no frisson of fear, of shame, of guilt, of that buyer's market, that seller's market, that dance done in courting, has created a culture that has an idea about purity which bears no resemblance to actual human behavior.
Oh, I met Aileen Kaminsky Crum right before the pandemic.
What was that like?
She was a blast. We actually met once before at a festival.
She strikes me as an absolutely wacky girl that I'd love to meet.
Oh, she's a hoot. Yeah, I'm hoping to record with her at some point.
She's got to be the most patient woman alive.
You'd think.
Yeah, I would assume. Yeah. Because he's, talk about walk in a park.
Well, I met him at the same time. It was recording with Pete Bagg, who...
I love Peter is one of my favorite people in the universe.
They were all in town for the Weirdo event in New York City, so I was recording with...
A great book.
I was recording with Pete, and he said...
John did a fabulous job.
Well, he said at the time when I was recording, this is fall of 19, he's like, Aileen and Bob are staying in the same hotel. Do you want me to introduce you to him after? I'm like, yeah, Peter, that would be very nice to get to meet Mr. Crum. Yeah. But I was talking
was
with
he
Aileen.
accessible?
Not so much.
He's unavailable.
Yeah,
right? Right.
But Aileen and I talked a little bit.
She seems like you could have coffee with her and have a great time.
Yeah. Well, the thing she mentioned was along these lines. There was a strip about, I guess it was losing her virginity, and it's part of a collection. And she was meeting fans, and they were really freaked out, these younger fans, because her character is saying no, don't, when it goes ahead. So therefore her losing her virginity was rape. And she's like, no, the whole thing was you're supposed to say no back then. And so she had to edit this thing decades later and put in a little caption explaining that, but secretly I wanted.
No. Look, it's like I every December I anticipate the advent of some other schmuck identifying Baby It's Cold Outside as a rape fantasy.
Yeah.
And those modern day comedian fuckers doing it, fuck you idiots. So,
but yeah, she has to go through, and it's you're college students and you've been raised in a different mentality with this stuff, but this is what reality was in the 50s and 60s.
Look, when we watched this David Simon series, The Deuce, I got into it with Ralph Reese. Ralph was saying it's not realistic. The girls never worked the 42nd; it was always 43rd. And my wife had no experience with this, and I was, and the second season starts about 5 years after the first. And I said, we're watching the first episode. There's a party, and I said, if you look in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, behind those two, that's me, right there, over there. But trying to explain to people that how it is now is not how it was, and just because now you think that now is the way it should be, doesn't make the was any less valid or reasonable. Having to explain to Gil Kane, who was literally under the assumption that my generation was fucking like rabbits unbidden. I explained that the courtship was different, but the quantity of courtship was the same. And it was my first understanding that we know that media lies about us as a generation, but we take what that same media says about other generations as face value. All those people out there who believe that Woodstock was the children, that men and women of my generation voting as we did was a betrayal of the Woodstock principle. Woodstock was a pimple on the ass of reality. It had nothing to do with what culture was. The guy Tommy, the character in Jersey Boys, says it right. He says that our listeners, the Four Seasons listeners, didn't protest; they went, and that is a far more defining element of my generation than Woodstock was. Woodstock was what we used to call weekend warriors. Yeah. It was dressing up. It was cosplay, and that it was just it was performative. It was just nonsense. It had nothing to do with the actual social statement of politics. And people today, of all ages and generations. I pointed out that my mother was a horrible woman when I was talking about Judy Garland, but there was a gift she gave me was of an appreciation for Garland and Edith Piaf. And a friend of mine, a woman that I've known for many, many years, who I don't see, but I'm on Facebook with her, defended her through her victimization of the patriarchy. And I said that she was awful before the patriarchy got to her, trust me. She didn't need any help from the patriarchy.
Yeah.
So please, for all the talk about mansplaining, there's a lot of womansplaining going on out there too.
Well, let me ask you. You mentioned Gil Kane a few times, and I can't remember if we discussed it the previous conversation we had, but tell me about the importance of having, I will say, mentors, older figures in your life, and whether you had that effect on younger artists or creators.
Well, I've always said I owe my career to 5 men. I stand on the shoulders of 5 men. It's Gil Kane, Gray Morrow, Wallace Wood, Neil Adams, and Joe Orlando, who wasn't so much a mentor as a rabbi at DC Comics, who helped me navigate the political atmosphere there because of my association with Gil, because Carmine and Gil hated each other's guts from the time they met as children. And my association with Gil was a poisonous, toxic presence.
You're on his team, therefore.
Exactly. And I don't draw anything like any of those guys. They didn't influence me in terms of what I draw.
I don't mean the direct visual, but the importance of
Woody was a cautionary tale. I didn't want to end up like that because I thought he was a hapless and narcissistic drunk who had pissed away a career. Gil was a Ghanaf, a liar, a cheat, and a thief who I admire for his work ethic more than anything else. Neil was a very difficult and complex guy. Nobody noted the fact that when I pointed out that he had died, that I hadn't had a relationship since the late 1970s with him. And Gray was sort of an affable presence who I learned a great deal about doing other people's work for them. But because of those guys, I have a career, and I've taken it very seriously since I was in my 30s, and I learned how to use assistants. That there are people out there who look at me as a mentor. Joe Jusko is one of those people. Dean Haspiel is another. Bat Lash worked for me for a brief time back in the 70s. And I've had, a slew of people who've worked for me because I've learned that there's things that I'm lazy about and there's things that I'd much rather be focused on. So I can delegate and can control. So the idea of apprenticeships and mentorships is very important to me. I met Gil when I was 13. I went to work for him when I was 18, when I heard through the grapevine that his assistant had died in his sleep. And I went to see him. He hired me on. I'm pretty sure he died owing me money. But what I got from Gil was there's a quotation that we learn more about watching good tennis being played than we do from reading a book about how to play good tennis. And the experience of watching Gil work, of seeing him work every day, of understanding his process, and then finding out years later of how much of his process had been invested in unlearning bad habits and learning new ones, despite the fact of being intimidated by such shitheels as Bob Kamiger and Bern Hogarth, who intellectually intimidated him enormously to the point where he became defensive and combative about his own uneducatedness and became an autodidact and a reader, that so much of that experience informs my own. The difference with Woody's experience was a profound disappointment. Gray sort of coasted above it all. And Neil's monomania was so pervasive. His sense of messianic, self was the dynamic of that relationship. I was Simon Peter to his Jesus.
Yeah.
And whereas Gil, for all of his arrogance and his condescension, I'm having a weird cramp here, never stopped learning about how to behave and how to do the job.
Were there lessons you didn't pick up on until years and years later? Things that you came in your 40s maybe to say, I should have picked up on.
Only what I said earlier about that capacity for improvisation.
Yeah.
Gil was very close with Gary Groth, and he didn't need to be flattered by Gary. Gary, I believe, always regarded his work as hyperbolic, and it certainly was. The great irony, and I've said this publicly, is that what separates me from those 5 men is that none of them could write worth a shit. Mm-hmm. And I believe that what gives my work whatever value it may have, and that sounds like humble bragging, but it's an understanding of the detachment from the work, is that I can write and draw with equal measure, and that the two things synergistically create a brand of value. And significantly, Woody never got beyond, pulp tales with some smut. Gray was always just sort of like doing Lynn Carter pastiches. Neil wrote incoherent.
That's a... Yeah,
I think Neil thought in the Batman Odyssey stuff that he was doing Frank Miller, and what he was doing was Norm Crosby, with a little bit of Al Kelly thrown in for fun. And Gill, who could write an essay like a motherfucker, could not write comics worth a shit. It was astonishing to me. He was incapable of writing material competitive on the page, because the thing about Gill is that I learned from him more than anything else how to think about the work that we were doing. Robert Fawcett wrote a book called On the Art of Drawing, which if you're looking for a book about drawing, it ain't it. What it is, it's a book that it's about the art of thinking about drawing. Mm-hmm. And to a great extent, what I got from Gill was thinking about the material. Like that story I told earlier about having him annotate CoverGirl for me and showing me the physical movement of Gene Kelly and how it informs his own work. The fact that he didn't understand, couldn't identify the difference between what Robert E. Howard was doing and what Fritz Leiber was doing is an indication of why the writing was so awful to a certain extent. That Howard was an unformed natural, and that Leiber was a drunken intellectual who was able to work in that world, but with a level of self-awareness that world never deserved. It's sort of like the difference between Alfred Bester and Isaac Asimov. Bester was a guy with a cosmopolitan sensibility, whereas Asimov was a guy with ideas, but without a set of adult experiences to inform those ideas. When you read The Demolished Man and The Stars Not Destination, you're clearly reading a guy who has lived an actual life, whereas Asimov's work is someone who's read about that life. And to a certain extent, Gill
embodied that.
He was a guy who didn't really. He loved comics. He was his ideal. He found himself in an ideal place between Jack Kirby and Alex Toth, and he began his career imitating Jack. He ended up imitating Toth, as everyone did, and ultimately schooled himself into the flayed figure work that became his archetype when he did all the work for Marvel. I know there are a lot of people out there who hold John Buscema in enormous esteem. I feel that Buscema is grossly overpraised. I believe that Gill was the guy who most successfully channeled the ethos of Jack Kirby when he worked for Marvel in the 1970s and 80s. I really loved that work that he did. I mean, it's hyperbolic and silly, but that's what Marvel comics were. They were deeply hyperbolic. I tell the story in Hey Kids. I was in the office at Marvel when Gill was there, probably stealing artwork, and I wish I were kidding. And the original pencils came in for that Avengers annual that Michael Golden did. I believe, as I've said more than once, that Michael Golden is the single most influential comic book artist to come into the business since the mid-'70s. There are people who built entire careers out of tropes and kabuki-like elements they've stolen from his work.
Who was the guy who was inking him back? Was Armando
Gill, who's I think in prison now.
Okay,
so they're all in prison. I think he was and the pencils were there, and watching Gill swarm into a blind and choate rage, culminating with him turning and he says, "How the fuck does he do this?" And it was it was not a rhetorical question; it was a real question. Excellent to the fact that Michael has an eidetic memory, purportedly, there is a level of craft there that is not Perel. Gill never learned to get past the 6-page-a-day place, that idea of turning a pencil.
Yeah.
The guy who called, Don Cameron, is a colleague of mine, who 20-some-odd years ago went to Gil's. More than that, I was Gil. He's been dead that long. We arranged for him to work with Gil for a couple of months to try to teach Gil how to use photographs, how to use reference. And it was just the most frustrating experience for them both, because Gil could not slow down enough to absorb the information required from the photographs. And Don was in absolute awe of Gil, was incapable of imposing his will on him to get him to do so. So it was a frustrating exercise on both accounts.
As someone who's just taken up drawing in the last year and a half, I get, to me, there's life drawing and there's screen. I still don't have that ability in between to imagine something and draw it. So, yeah, I'm still learning to see, basically, as this stuff goes.
I mean, I use reference. My process is I do my sticks and circles, I do my rough pencil, and then when I've got the rough pencil set up, I then take up photographic reference and start applying it. There's a collection of books from England from the 1970s called the Fairbairn System, which is English character actors of that era. The only drawback is, of course, because it's the 1970s, none of the guys under the age of 50 had ears. Yeah. Their hair's all covered in their ears.
I thought you were going to go over their teeth, too, but go.
No, don't be kind to our English cousins. They're vital, because the character and every comic book artist in my generation has those books. You can always find who's using them. There's that guy.
Yeah, I know that pose or that posture.
More face, these English guys, and but for the rest of it, for photographs, it's for locations and backgrounds, I never make anything up. I don't fake shit, and it's because we live in a world where verisimilitude matters. So that's where that's at. But we went to see a show a couple of years before in New York called War Paint with Patti LuPone and Christine Ebersol, a show called War Paint about the war between Elizabeth Arden and Helena Rubinstein. From the same people who did the musical version of Grey Gardens. We expected great, and it was awful, just dreadful. And the show starts in the 1930s and ends in the early 60s. And I turned to my wife as we were leaving. I said, my takeaway from this is that I can convincingly fake up a woman's dress from 1935 to 1965. I'm pretty good at that. I can cover that. I know the shape, but I still will look for reference to make sure I get it right. And when I do period stuff with other writers, they're always stunned by the fact that the hair is right, the lapels are right, because the work deserves this. One of the things the Brits do better than us on television, for example, is period haircuts. Yeah. I hate seeing guys with long hair and supposedly,
Yeah, Amy and I were just watching something a couple of days ago when she made a comment along those lines that, like, an American thing wouldn't have let that guy have that appearance. He looks wrong by our beautiful standards, but perfect for...
Exactly. Yeah. And I just get it right. There's no reason for that, But there's a lot of reasons, because there's the arrogance of performance. So that was a digressive answer to a lot of questions.
Oh, for God's sake! We digress. That's our thing. But yeah, it's that sense of the mentoring and the legacy thing. Well, did you want to write before you wanted to draw?
No.
Okay.
I never saw it as a.
That's why when it came into how you discovered yourself as a writer or made yourself as a writer.
Well, I became a writer because I realized that most of the people who were writing comics of my generation were failed artists. And none of them seemed to be as well read as the artists. All they read were comic books. But the artists that I knew, all of us were deeply read in comics. We also read all the heroic fantasy. Then we read crime fiction. And most of us were rock and roll fans. And we had, we were moviegoers. I mean, we were deeply steeped in every aspect of culture. And when you had... Claude and I got into a kerfuffle on a panel in Canada, over artists. And, I insisted that Robert Fawcett was the one true king. And Claude dismissed him because he's a Joseph Clement Cole guy. We've since, this is the kind of arguments that guys in their 20s have. But, being completely enraptured with period material. Look, my walls are covered with work from, the Whitmore piece is 49, the Parker piece is early 50s, the Beckhoff is 50, the Whitcomb is 55, the McGinnis, I don't know the exact time, that's the Hearst is late 40s, the Gilbert whatever it is, Gilbert Bundy is from the late 40s. That's 62, Bernie Fuchs. So, but I like the idea of historicity and cultural curiosity. I watch a lot of period material. I've got a list of television shows that I'm supposed to try to catch up while Laurel's awake because I can see them without her being around. And, that's Peaky Blinders. I'm curious about that. I'm a huge fan. I'm also going to watch For All Mankind, which is my...
I've heard, but I haven't watched.
It gets off to a very clunky start.
That's what I've been concerned about.
The first episode is very clunky, but it gets good really fast, and the second season is fantastic, mostly because of Michael Dorman. Michael Dorman is a New Zealand actor who is now starring on Joe Pickett, the C.J. Box novels. He originally broke out on Patriot. Did you watch Patriot?
Yeah. I watched about 5 or 6 episodes. And then I think they canceled it after season 2.
See the whole thing.
Okay.
See all of it. He is that eccentricity informs the performance. He carries the second season of For All Mankind. Okay. And there's a quizzicalness about him that is really appealing. And it's really good. I really like the show. And again, it's cheating on reality. I never watched Battlestar Galactica. I couldn't care less, but I like that's what
I like the Lauren Green ones back when I was a kid.
Even I was too
I was 9. What the hell?
But also I'm an Outlander. I watch Outlander, which is the archetypal chick show.
Yeah, my wife loves it.
My wife has no interest in it whatsoever, and I love the show. I found out a couple of years back, that my oldest pal, the guy I've known, that photograph of the kid wearing a perfect Captain America outfit, reading a copy of Captain America #1 with a shield. So that's my pal Dave in 1964, taken at one of Souling's first shows. And Dave and I have been friends since I'm 20. And we found out over dinner one time. He said, "You too? My God, we're Outlanders!" And about 3 weeks later, I met one of the girls, one of the women of the show, a character named Galis, who had an odd use of American English. Turned out she was Dutch. And as soon as I found that, it made complete sense. I understood it completely. Yeah. It's kind of like Connie Nielsen being Danish, and the way
Yeah, then it's okay.
That makes sense. Yeah. There you go. Yeah. And I'm a huge fan. Just absolutely insane for it. I love the show. As silly and foolish as it is, but I'm a Moore guy, so For All Mankind is really worth seeing. Despite Joel Kinnaman's kind of stiffitude, there's some great stuff on the show. Did you watch Get Shorty, the TV series?
No, I didn't have whatever streaming service it was on.
There's a woman named Sonia Wagel, who's an English actress, who plays a very evil character on this show for 3 seasons, who plays a character named Molly Cobb on the show. The show is about, the franchise?
Which?
Of For All Mankind?
Yeah, the principal being the Russians got there first.
And the space race never ends.
Yeah.
And it becomes a huge part of American culture. And to his great credit, what he does is he does something I do, which is bury things in passing conversation and dialogue without pointing a finger at it. Comics congratulates itself now for its inclusivity and its diversity, and that diversity includes having a character who happens to be gay, and that's all they are. That's the entire
their
franchise.
identity.
It's just completely.
Yeah.
And there's no evolution. At one point in the second season, it becomes clear that the internet exists at a time when the internet did not exist.
Yeah.
And that there's technology that we take for granted, and it's a different name.
Yeah.
But we have technology that we take for granted now that is perfectly operative in the early 80s.
There's a science fiction novel by Christopher Brown called Tropic of Kansas that has it's wonderful. It came out in the last couple of years. Chris has been on a few times.
I don't know his work.
Oh, I'll send you everything, because I think
send me a link. I'll pick it up.
You will groove on his stuff.
Okay.
But alternate reality basically splits off in the 70s, and over time you start to realize there is an internet, and it's a very different internet than what we have here. If the Defense Department still controlled X, Y, and Z,
right.
This is where things would have gone, and so you get some of the grand challenge everything runs into is how do you run a world without cell phones and still have a plot? And
that's the only aspect of SF writing that I have any interest in. Alternate universes.
This is real good. It's illegal. It becomes legal climate fiction also over time, but you will groove on all of this stuff.
For example, I wish Harry Turtledove was a better writer. His franchise is great, but the writing is just drip. And as much as Keith Laumer is now decried and defamed, Worlds of the Imperium was a phenomenal alternate worlds novel. I did a cover for it. Walter owns the original. that's the cheating on reality stuff is the only place I like to go to.
Yeah.
Like Ward, what was it? Ward Campbell, Bring the Jubilee. So where the Civil War was a negotiated peace.
Don't know it.
Yeah, it's odd.
Yeah,
it's very odd. It's
anytime you're branching off in that direction.
Well, I mean, Harry Harrison, that great American communist who lives in Ireland, wrote a book about a guy who goes back in time with the plans that were dropped into Paris into France for the resistance to build machine guns from hand crank parts, and equips the Pickett's charge with submachine guns.
It's a lot more imagination in science fiction than other genres out there. But
the number of good writers in it is thin on the ground. I mean, Harrison is one of those guys.
Yeah.
Harrison. I love the Stainless Steel Rat. I recommend it to.
Those are the books of my childhood. They're 10 years old. This was just reading the little omnibus to pieces.
I recommended it to a producer friend of mine that he get a hold of Alexei Panshin, because I thought the Anthony Villiers novels would be an interesting choice for work. Mm-hmm. And apparently Panshin was just totally inapproachable, difficult to deal with. Like waiting to be robbed. Those guys. So,
post Times Square dream project.
I'm just working.
I'm still wasn't sure. Is there something if I had time?
I have time.
Yeah.
No, I have time. What I'm working on right now. I'm in. Last night, before I went to bed, I finished page 8 of the first dialogue pass of issue 4 of 6 of the third volume of Hey Kids Comics, which is the first volume is about Silver Age and disappointment. The second volume is about the unanticipated consequences and impact of EC. And the third volume is about fandom. And I'm done. I'm going with that, and I just pulled out my rough drafts for the sequel to The Divided States of Hysteria, which is called Hostile Makeover. It's about the collapse of the Western civilization, and no one notices it because of the capacity for bread and circuses distractions that are provided by media.
Where are you getting that from? I don't understand.
Can't imagine. The great frustration with the reaction to Divided States was the fact that just as those Art Spiegelman head shoved up his ass clowns perceived me as a mainstream guy, the mainstream sees all material produced for it through the same filter, and in the context of one of the reasons I do short form material as opposed to extended narrative is that I grew up reading fiction in which characters change and evolve. In the course of Midnight of the Soul, the hero of Midnight of the Soul is a wine addicted agoraphobe who hasn't seen the world since he got out of the army with a wound, and whose memory of what got him that wound in the first place is totally skewed by drugs and alcohol, who in the moment of clarity discovers that his memory is screened, and he has a change. He transforms, he becomes a different person. The same thing is true of Marked Man. But in comic books, change is identified by giving Spider-Man a new costume and maybe putting the circle around or taking it off on Batman's logo. And it's one of the reasons why I have no interest in comics. I mean, I watched part of the Everybody Dies in the Marvel Universe, but they don't really, over someone's shoulder on an airplane, and realized that, I'm interested in the concept of closure and the permanence of death.
That's exactly where I am. I mean, since I was a kid, if you invalidate death in these stories and everybody comes back and it was just a dream.
But you're also dealing with an audience that needs characters to root for, and I don't need to. That's not why I'm reading fiction. What does that say about Patricia Highsmith? Or Jim Thompson, for Christ's sake, or David Goodis, or W.R. Burnett, or Horace McCoy, or Richard Stark.
Yeah.
This insistence of having niceness just appalls me. I know so many people in comic books who are literally worthy of a painful death, who are very nice, but they're just horrible fucking human beings. So when I took all this heat, this calumny on the Divided States, it didn't occur to me until after the fact. It was because they assumed that as it is, as it shall ever be, that this character doesn't go through a change. That if you read the book and you actually finish at the end, you realize the character became the moral focus of the book and the romantic interest of the lead. I was asked to do a one-pager for a 1,000-page omnibus of comics, and I had no idea what to do. And I decided to do the moment when Frank becomes an active agent of romance with Chrissy. And I had no idea how to do it. So I called 2 friends. One of them is now my assistant. The other is someone who I know from various means and circumstances, who's been in a long time domestic relationship with a former transgender porn actress, who's now like a normal person. Just like watching them
left the career and just
yeah. They're not. I wouldn't say a housewife, but they live convivially and romantically, and watching them communicate is really an exciting experience. It really is. And I asked for both. I needed how would that be? How does that work?
Yeah.
And I got all the information I needed from my assistant, but I realized that her experience was different from what I was seeking. His experience is what I wanted, and I gave him a nudge, and all of a sudden I got 3 pages. No indentations, single space. That was phenomenal in its depth and incredibly helpful. It informed everything I've done in the sequel, and the relationship as portrayed in the single 1 page. The narratives, in the same way in the first book, the narrative was provided by internet chatter. That's the whole thing. But the second volume is Chrissy's blog. She explains how things go, what's really happening. And I set that up in this 1 page, and it's a nice piece. I'll send it to you if you'd like to see it. It's pretty cool. But the narrative as set up in the second volume is about a war against time being fought by a media mogul entrepreneur and a political action committee organizer, to right wing and left wing, over drugs, power, water, and land, while everything else is going to hell. And it's being fought by private armies. It's being fought by NGOs and government officials unaware that they're serving this, while our heroes are serving as agents provocateurs in South America, because South America is the safest place to be at this point. And ultimately, they recognize the fact that there's no one good to work for. There's no one to serve. And they must serve themselves. And they carve out a piece of the world for themselves through extremely unnice things. Mm-hmm. But they have a happy ending of some sort, of a version of a happy ending, with a line that I think has the same weight and value in the context of this as Joey Brown's last line in Some Like It Hot.
Yeah.
It works for me. I got a laugh out of my assistant. My assistant, I might, is a trans woman who lives in Dallas, who I've known since 1984. Jeez. Yeah. So, who was astonished at the capacity of my accusation of being transphobic. Yeah, really? Really? What? No.
Yeah, but again, people just want their quick bite of outrage,
right? Well, but again, I'm waiting for somebody, one of these people. I'm waiting now. It's been 5 fucking years. Come talk to me in person. See how it works. Tell me what you really think. Tell me how you feel about me personally, as opposed to behind the duck blind of the internet.
That was the thing I read from it was about Steve Bannon a couple of days ago, that essentially the whole Gamergate thing and everything they sort of activated, his whole sense is there's the person in real life whose life is shit, lives in the basement, etc., with the parents. But he said online, he's Ajax, the warrior. And that's the person I'm recruiting. I don't care about the guy who lives in the basement. I want the guy who is a superhero in this online.
Look.
The real life, they ran into January 6th, and it all.
Which I still feel, as I've said more than once, is a reflection of the impact and the infection of modern culture of cosplay.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly where Bannon ran into with this. We'll get all these guys together, and this is what's going to happen. And then you end up with, QAnon shaman, and that's still and I came up with John Crowley recently, and it's something I should ask you. What do you do when real life really outstrips the most outrageous shit you come up with? I
don't do anything because it's pointed out for me.
Yeah.
There are enough people out there who've read my stuff for years who say, what? Look, Chaykin. Look at
he already predicted.
I don't believe in prescience. I really don't. I mean, the fact of the matter is, so much of Flag was informed by my disgust at people who literally said that they held Ronald Reagan's social policies in complete contempt, but they really like his economic policies. As if there was some way you could vote for one and not get the other.
And that they weren't inextricably linked, just you carefully segmented them yourself. Yeah.
The whole idea of translating that rage onto paper. I said earlier that I missed the 90s, that I lost my audience there, And a lot of that antagonism that was aimed at me 5 years ago was come from people who thought that I was new on the scene, that I hadn't existed.
Who's this guy?
Well, there's the irony, of course, is that, one of the Flag's impact on the business had nothing whatsoever to do with the readership and everything to do with the talent pool. It was a book that never achieved a widespread commercial value because it wasn't published by the majors, and B, it didn't present itself in a way that identified with the audience's perception of certain tropes. Despite the fact that comics has always been a medium, it has now become since the 1980s a genre, and certainly more enforceably so with the advent of the success of the movies, because the movies have utterly. Remember, you're dealing with billions of dollars being spent on material that millions of the people who are spending that money have no idea that the source material exists, and that they don't give a fuck. But comic books, because they're perceived as a genre, Flag did not fit into that loophole. I mean, despite the transgressive nature of Dark Knight, which is, for my money, as ideologically incoherent as you could get, and
that's putting it kindly, but go on.
Yeah. Well, that's just me.
Yeah.
And the obvious contempt for the material that Watchmen had, they both looked like superhero comic books. And Watchmen was, of course, misread by a swarm of the talent pool who related to the way so many shitheels in Hollywood related to what makes Sammy run, which is to say, not as a cautionary tale, but as a training manual.
Yeah, let's do this.
Let's do this, exactly. And if Flag had a mask and worn a cape, it would have had a higher impact. But it didn't look like what it was supposed to look like. It didn't say what it was supposed to say.
It was a science fiction comic. Yeah. It wasn't a superhero comic.
Yeah, exactly. And it was, as Clay Geard has said, it may have taken place in 2031, but it was about 1933. And to a profound extent, that's true. It's a book that looked forward to the past. And, I was writing about an element of depression. The bicentennial year in New York City was huge. It was a real turning point for New York City. And I had ptomaine poisoning. It was something else. I looked like the Jewish Brian Ferry for about 6 months. I was so skinny from vomiting and being unable to eat. But it was a phenomenal time. It really was, because there was this enormous anxiety and fear about the money being spent to celebrate the bicentennial, because there had been such a disastrous misunderstanding of that value some 15 years previous during the Civil War centennial. The Civil War centennial cost people fortunes. It was a disaster commercially. Nobody gave a fuck about the Civil War, except now. And there was fear on the part of people that the bicentennial money was going to evaporate just like that. It was a huge success. That was the best time.
Good roll word that Skylab was going to land on us. But anyway, that's going back to when I was 5 years old.
But that anxiety that so much informed my feelings about patriotism. And I remember being criticized for a piece I'd written about patriotism in Flag by a bunch of sniffy little cunts from England and the States in the rock and roll journalism business who identified patriotism as silly and pointless. And it's because they didn't know, in the same way that people didn't know what Leo DeRoche meant when he said, nice guys finish last. What he meant was good guys finish last. In the same way that people misunderstood patriotism as meaning nationalism. And I'm not a nationalist. I'm a patriot. I take very seriously the ideals of America, despite the realities of, it's actions that matter more than intentions. But in this particular case, I had to at least identify there were intentions involved. I mean, as I've said more than once, when the American Civil War was being fought, my great-great-grandparents were protecting my great-grandparents from Cossack rape. So, I'm...
Join the club.
Yeah. No, and you have even more credential than I do, I mean, I'm a guy who hated Fiddler on the Roof because I always felt it was a sentimentalized bullshit version of my grandparents' experience until I saw Bart Sher's production.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a couple of years back. I found myself in New York City. I went to see a matinee. That night I saw Waitress that night. Boy, did I hate Waitress. Sarah Bareilles. No, bad. And I went to see it. Danny Burstein playing Tevye. You know the production?
I've heard of a great one in recent years. This must be the one you're referring to, but yeah.
I'm sitting there. It's August. I'm sorry, it's June. I'm in my front row mezz, sitting next to a comatose Jewess, not my wife, and the entire balcony is filled with high school kids, with grammar school kids from the Bronx, getting a day off for half price tickets in the theater. And the show opens on a black stage, and I've seen a lot of productions. My wife loves the show because she thinks it's good. And Danny is downstage right, wearing a parka, a hoodie, and carrying a tourist guide. And there's a sign on the upper right that says Anatevka. He looks over, he reads it, he looks and compares it to the book, goes back to where he was downstage right, and a stagehand in black gloves removes the hoodie and the parka, and he becomes Tevye. I lost it. I completely lost my shit. I burst into tears. I spent the entire first act weeping piteously. Comatose Jewess, no reaction. I'm dying. I'm literally just, I am bawling piteously. Just, the table of metal cam soil, just it's killing me. Okay. Intermission comes along. I call my wife. I'm verklempt to the max. I call her up and I explain to her. She starts laughing at me, and then she tells me a horrible anecdote about a colleague of ours. Truly disgusting. And the two of us were laughing at someone else's expense in a profound and deep and dark way. And she gets me out of my mood. That's great. Okay. I settle down. Up in the balcony, the kids are all doing their impression of Tevye. And the usher, who came out of Central Casting, New York Theater Ushers, she's a 5'1" Irish lesbian, who is yelling at the kids, "Don't open that door. Do not open that door." She turns to me. I'm laughing. She turns to me and says, "I work Chicago. I never have to deal with this shit." So, all right. I sit down. Second act begins. And the production had a lot of the yeshiva boys were played by women. So there was an incredible dance company of gypsy girls doing boy parts, and it was phenomenal. Okay. Show goes on. Blah, 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 blah. Jessica Hecht as Golda. And the show ends, with all the citizens of Anatevka making their way to the train station to make their way to America. And it's they're circling the stage. They're pulling wagons, they're walking, they're carrying the bundles, and Danny disappears. And he reappears. I can't even thinking about this right now. Look at this. This is so fucking sad. It's
power theater.
He reappears as the American tourist, wearing the hoodie and the parka, and I just completely, right now, I'm sorry. It killed me. It just destroyed me. I'm out on the street. It's a 2:00, so I'm out there. It's just before 5, and I text Danny Burstein, who plays Tevye. I said, "You and Cher have a lot to apologize for." And the only response I get is, "Ha!"
You got me.
Oh man, it just killed me. Again, going right back to what we were talking about earlier, that visceral identification with physical presence. Yeah. Just destroyed. It just killed me. Would not have worked in a movie. It was something that is so completely stage bound and so completely identification based that it just wrapped me up and owned me. I've always been a fan of Cher's, and I've been a fan of Burstein's literally since I saw him in The Drowsy Chaperone. We met very briefly, and we've been in touch. He's a comics fan. I got to see house seats. I got house seats to see Moulin Rouge from him, and also that production of Follies with Bernadette Peters. But it just destroyed me. It just killed me.
Piece of theater you would want to go see? You said you haven't been to anything since.
What's up now, or a dream show that I want to see?
Both. What do you want to go see now? And
I'd like to see Paradise Square. because it's about something I really care about. I still feel that what's his name, Kevin Baker's City on Fire trilogy is some of the best writing about New York City I've ever read. Paradise Alley, Stryver's Row, and what's it called, Dreamland. Have you read the books?
No.
They're really good. Baker also wrote a great novel, a roman à clef about the O'Dwyer administration. Again, this is some pretty granular shit, but it interests me. I'd like to see someone. I mean, the last production of Guys and Dolls that I saw just sucked a bag of dicks. It was terrible, miscast, dreadfully performed, just an overall mess. Oliver Platt as Nathan Detroit was not a good idea. Lauren Graham could neither sing nor dance, so she was not a really good replacement for Adelaide. The only one who acquitted himself with any value was Craig Bierko, who did okay. And Titus Burrell was pretty good as Nicely Johnson. But I'd like to see Before I Die. I'd like to see a seriously good production on a par with what Jerry Zaks did with Nathan Detroit, Nathan Lane, and I saw it with Adam Arkin and Tom Wopat. I'm one of those guys who doesn't. I've never seen the Dukes of Hazzard. I've seen Wopat on stage a lot.
It's weird to have that frame of reference as opposed to.
Well, I was at a show in Nashville, a Wizard convention, years and years ago, and the show tanked. Whether it was the weather, it was raining, or whatever it was, nobody came to the show. And among the media guests were the cast of Dukes of Hazzard. I'd met John Schneider a couple of years earlier when he'd just been fired, when killed off on Smallville. We had a long conversation about his attempt to workshop by Bob Wills in his Texas Playboys musical, which I still think is a great idea. And I'm walking across the celebrity floor. There's no one there. Wopat's sitting alone at his table with his handler, I guess. And I walk over and I said, "Mr. Wopat, I've never seen the Dukes of Hazzard, but I've seen you on stage a lot. I'd seen him in the musical version of The Catered Affair. It was written by Harvey. Terrible show, just an awful show. Everybody looked like they were sleeping walking through it. He was there. He showed up. His performance of Sondheim is astonishing. He's a great interpreter of Sondheim on stage. And I saw him, as I say, opposite Adam Arkin as Sky Masterson. He played Sky to Adam Arkin's Nathan. And I saw him in the West Coast production of City of Angels, replacing James Naughton, who had played the part. And he was unflatterable. He was so pissed off at nobody showing up, he thought he was wasting his time. And, blah, blah, blah. So we talked. And I asked him where he lived. I assumed he lived in Laughlin, because I assumed he had a cabaret career. Because he has that kind of presentation. He's really good on stage. And he said, "No, I live on 72nd and Broadway." And I cracked up. and he was annoyed at me for laughing, and I couldn't explain why I was laughing. That night, made me dinner with Danny Fingeroth. Danny's a landsman, tomorrow. And I said to Danny, and we're having dinner with Danny and a couple of other people, and I told him this story, and he laughed as well. And the other person with us wondered why we were laughing. And I said, "It's because all I could think of when Tom Wopat told me he lived on 76th and Broadway, was that I could see him on Sunday mornings at Zabar's demanding that he wanted the Nobi cut in the center, not in the end."
Yeah.
Je suis là.
Again,
digression is my life. I can't help it.
And I shouldn't ask, but I did watch it and enjoyed it for the Andrew Garfield side of it. I have no background with Rent or anything like that, but Tick, Tick, Boom?
Couldn't begin to be interested. I hated Rent so much.
Yeah. I'd never seen it, don't know anything about it. I just heard the Andrew Garfield rendition of this writer.
It's another one of those shows I want to punch in the face. I mean, we went to see it, the production that was to the Amundsen, and we left at the intermission. We hated it so much. Its narcissism, its sense of entitlement, it was just really appalling. And the fact that they had to get Bradley Whitford, who's Hollywood's one of Hollywood's Gentile go-tos to play Jews, to play Sondheim. No, sorry, no. I couldn't care less.
Favorite Sondheim?
Follies. Okay. It's about everything I care about. And certainly, if you've read the third Final Time Squared, there's a lot of Follies references going on in there.
from page one.
And again, I love Follies. I finally got a chance to see Merrily We Roll Along in a terrible production. I've been trying to get. There was apparently a great London show, but my wife favors Sweeney Todd. She loves Sweeney Todd. It's her favorite show of all time. We
will note that you have the Stephen Sondheim coffee mug here.
Which when I go to Zoom meetings and I'm drinking it, people wonder about my sexual orientation. They presume.
Yeah.
They presume. At any rate, but Follies for me is what it's all about. I love the franchise. I've seen a terrible production. I've seen great productions. The Treat Williams version just was awful, just dreadful. The only thing good about it was Polly Bergen as Carlotta.
You ever thought of writing, or have you had attempts at writing theater? And musical theater, especially.
No, I'm not.
Is this something
I'm a comic book man. I mean, it's hard enough to do that. And I'm one of the reasons I don't like video games is that I'm of a mind that I want to be entertained. I don't want to have to entertain myself. Yeah. And the musical theater is something that I'm an absolute fan of. Yeah. You know, I mean, and I've seen some bad shit. You know, I mean, we were talking at breakfast this morning, as a matter of fact, with colleagues. Years ago, we were in town to see. Back in the day, before the collapse of Western civilization, I would be in New York twice a year. I would go in with my wife for a week, and then with colleagues from here, friends. One of whom is a legendary prop master. I just gave him that new book by Stephen Heller about props. Yeah, and he was like, "Oh God!"
Stephen's memoir is coming out in October.
I hear he's not a really good guy, but I love.
Oh, he's great people.
Is he really?
Yeah, we've recorded a couple of times. We've had good conversations. Somebody brought up the idea that
I know why I hate him. I know why I heard him. I know why someone I know hates him so much. Yeah, that it's the same way with who was it? There's any number of people that I hate that guy. But why should I hate him?
It's usually just one weird career thing that happened.
It's always that way.
But somebody brought up the idea of doing a documentary of people who got their first gig through Stephen Heller.
Right.
And it was just, when I started bringing it up with a couple, they're like, oh my God, I would love to be in it. And I mentioned to Stephen, he's like, no interest whatsoever in my own thing.
Works for me.
Yeah.
But yeah, I bought him the book. And so we were in New York and we had tickets to see Glengarry Glen Ross, the production with Fred Weller. And with Al Pacino as Shirley the Machine. And Pacino gets a cold. We have an open night, so we go to see a show. The worst. With a cast, George Hearn, Andy Szymanski, Marin Mazzie. You could do a lot worse than those three. Good.
Didn't work.
Kathy Lee Gifford's musical about Amy Semple McPherson. So dreadful. But again, even George Hearn couldn't carry it. And Hearn can do anything, you know. So, but again, there have been some transcendent moments. I mean, the production of Follies with Danny Burstein and Bernadette Peters, astonishing. Watching Pennies from Heaven last night, the night before last. I pointed out John McMartin, who plays as a pivotal part in the picture, played Ben in the original production of Follies. You know, I'd forgotten that Tommy Rowell is in Pennies from Heaven. He's 52 years old, and he can still dance his ass off. Yeah. You know, because like Laurel had never seen Kiss Me Kate. Kiss Me Kate's a terrible movie. It's just awful. Yeah. But there's that sequence with Tommy Rowell, Bobby Van, and Bob Fosse dancing their asses off around Ann Miller, you know, in Tom, Dick, or Harry. And it's just like, marry me, marry me, marry me. And it's just, you know, you look at Rowell, and Rowell's a force of nature. And that led us down another rabbit hole on YouTube and see more of Rowell and Fosse dancing together. You know, so for me, my transcendence, that production of Fiddler was a pretty transcendent experience. Yeah. A Few Good Men, the original production, Prelude to a Kiss, and seeing Ian McKellen do Richard III at the Wadsworth, which was the last date I had with anyone before I started seeing Laurel exclusively. I went there. I was dating a woman that I had an odd relationship with, and I was assuming we would be leaving after, you know, at intermission, and I couldn't leave. It was just a genuinely transcendent experience. We had amazing seats to the point where we were watching snot and spit flying across the stage, left and right. And it was one of those weird casts where there were no men in the film, in the production who were anywhere near on a par with McKellen's performance, whereas the women were all up to snuff. It was an astonishing series of performances. It just killed me, destroyed me.
But staying distant from practicing theater is important to you.
Yeah,
if you're on the inside of it,
I cherish the experience of being an audience member. I truly do. I really love it. I mean, from the minute, again, I don't remember whether it was Kismet. There were three shows: Kismet,
King and I,
and Carousel. We saw it was the King and I was Darren McGavin played the King opposite Risa Stevens. Darren McGavin, yes, the Kolchak the Night Stalker as the King of Siam.
Oh, I'm always going with a Christmas Story for him. But anyway,
for me, the Christmas Story is James Broderick.
Yeah.
The original production was on PBS American Playhouse. And John Raitt recreated the role of Billy Bigelow at Lincoln Center, and then Alfred Drake playing the lead in Kismet. But the real draw for that was the fact that the guy who played Sergeant Garcia on Zorro was playing the Wazir. Was I Wazir? It was fabulous. From that moment on, I was completely... And again, I don't think I made the intellectual understanding of how much that felt like comics. But the relationship was I was imprinted with it. It just informed me enormously. I was a regular theater goer when I lived in New York. It was one thing I miss when now when I go to New York, I go to the theater every day. Years ago, we were in town. My son was in town. He took my wife to see the Red Sox play the Yankees. I went to see the production of Company with Raul Esparza, rather, directed by John Doyle. And I like Company a lot, too.
Yeah. But still.
I've had tickets to see the new production of Company twice, and both times had to cancel. Katrina Lenk. I saw Katrina Lenk in The Band's Visit, which is one of the most confounding and beautiful musicals I've ever seen. And I assumed from her performance that she was European. But I found that she's from Michigan.
Sure. Okay.
Well, I also saw Daniel Fish's production of Oklahoma, the October before the lockdown. And went in there like this, expecting to hate it. And was flabbergasted by how much I loved it. It just blew me away. A little I'd seen it on the Tonys looked really twee. And it was astonishing in its and then 3 days later, the next day rather, I saw Hadestown, which I fucking hated. It was like Wizard for heterosexual adults. It was terrible. I thought it was grossly overblown and just lugubrious and lumbering and self-involved, and just wanted to punch it in the face.
I always see billboards for it when I go into the Lincoln Tunnel. There's a big
it's usually popular. It's usually popular, but it's just so obvious. It's just it's like, this is for you who haven't read a book. Here you go. This is for you.
So, last question: who are you reading?
What am I reading? I just do I want to sound pretentious or realistic or both?
You can go with everything.
What have I read recently? How's that?
Yeah. What have you been up to?
I'm listening to Chris Offutt's new novel.
Yeah.
Offutt's a crime writer I really like. He's a novel called Shifty's Boys. I'm reading John Benteen's Fargo. I was recommended this by a guy I admire dearly. A guy named Michael Stratford. Mike's an executive at Warner Brothers who covers the additional package product in DVD packaging. And we are crime fiction guys, just all that stuff. So we've known each other for many. We're introduced by Kaluta.
Okay.
And there's a photograph of me with Michael, just the February before the lockdown that was taken by Mike. Okay. Fargo is the character that clearly is derived and based quite literally on the character Lee Marvin played in The Professionals. They're action adventure novels set in the time before the United States entered the First World War. In terms of actually good writing, good stuff, I just recently recommended Tom Nichols' Our Own Worst Enemy to people, and I'm going back. I mean, I just recently reacquired, after reading an extensive piece by Caitlin Flanagan in the Atlantic about doing the Stations of the Cross of Joan Didion's life.
Oh, I bookmarked that. I haven't read it yet.
It's really good. It's really, really good. I like Flanagan a lot anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, she's something else. So I reacquired in the Kindle. I reacquired all the Didion stuff.
Yeah.
And not the fiction. I don't like the fiction.
No, the essays, the reportage.
Yeah. There's something so chilling about her stuff that I really love, because I was huge. I mean, I love Dunn's fiction. I thought I loved Playland. Not Playland. Is it Playland? That might be Playland. And True Confessions remains one of the great post-noir noirs ever. Mm-hmm. It's a good movie, but I still think it would have been better had
James Wood, right?
No. It's Robert Duvall is the priest, and Robert Duvall. I'm sorry, Robert De Niro is the priest, and Robert Duvall is the cop.
No, I think
it should have been the other way around.
Yeah.
It should have been the other way around.
Did you see the documentary that Griffin Dunn did on Joan Didion? Oh,
no.
I think
Where
it's
is
on
it?
Netflix.
Okay.
Just look up documentary Joan Didion. Griffin Dunn's the nephew.
Easy to find.
And, we were talking before this about the Judd Apatow, 4-hour long.
Right.
This is about 90, 95 minutes.
As it should be.
Yeah. And for someone who has a significant body of work in Joan Didion and an eventful life, and Dunn compresses and gets everything in there. He's got her on screen, even though her health is starting to decline. It's illuminating.
I don't think
watch.
someone I'd want to admit. It's not someone I think they would admit. I would assume that she would be incapable of concealing whatever contempt she'd have for me. But I do love the fact, as Flanagan points out in this piece, of how easily her political conservatism is forgotten. That I continue to find that fascinating, because it so informs the way she thinks. And having spent as much time as I have in Sacramento,
I was going to say it's all northern, not all, but it's of a piece with being raised in Northern California and in Sacramento.
Sacramento is so other a landscape. It wasn't until I went to Ottawa and spent some time there that I began to really understand why Sacramento was the way it was. Its capitalness informs itself so much. I really miss the fact that Wizard no longer they no longer exist. Wizard used to have a great show in Sacramento, and the hotel they put us at was across the street from the Capitol. And I got to know and befriend the concierge, who was a very complex guy. Very complex.
I'm sure he's somebody who's seen a lot.
Oh, no. Off mic.
Yes,
and one of the things I discovered that Sacramento, because it was such an expense account town, had some of the best restaurants in California. It was astonishing. I mean, there's like...
she writes about some of the real estate scammery.
It's just...
Yeah.
Reading, to a certain extent, Sacramento deserves a William Kennedy, the way Albany had William Kennedy.
Yeah.
Because Kennedy, the sage of Albany, the way Kennedy wrote about Albany, the way Leonard, to a certain extent, glanced off the presence of Detroit. Sacramento deserves that as well, and that doesn't really have it. But I'm right now. I have a book going in the car all the time because I can't bear radio. And like I say, the Fargo stuff is really short and tight. I just and the Offutt stuff is great. And I try to break up challenging with easy because I'm old and I like to play around.
I got to balance podcasts and quote unquote extracurricular.
Look, every day I check to see if Alan First has published anything recently.
Yeah,
he's overdue for a book. John Lawton, who I just adore. Thomas Perry, the great thriller guys. I can't read Child anymore because he's no longer writing the books. His brother's writing them, and they're just not very good. But in terms of the mainstream stuff, it's Thomas Perry always. I'm looking forward to what they're going to do with the old man. I'm with Jeff Bridges. He's the last guy I would have chosen to play the part, but he's perfect.
Yeah,
I never even thought about that. Lawton is a guy who's on the branding. It's Alan First, Lawton. Don Winslow says he's not writing fiction anymore, but we'll see. I miss Lawrence Block. Block retired. He's still with us, but he's not writing. He hasn't written in years. And there's nobody come along who's replaced Ed McBain or Donald Westlake or Elmore Leonard. There's just no one there. And when they find unpublished Westlake manuscripts, there's frequently a reason why they're unpublished. They're just not very good.
Yeah, bottom of the drawer should stay in the drawer.
Pretty much. I'm curious about the new. Mostly it's television. I'm curious about the new Dennis Lehane series. Lehane created a series called Blackbird with Taron Egerton, and again Peaky Blinders, the final season. There's a lot of stuff out there. I'm curious about The Staircase. I think with Colin Firth, with Laurel gone for the week.
You've got time.
Well,
I'm keeping you from it.
There's stuff. Please. Okay. And once you book out of here, I got to write at least 5 or 6 pages today. Yeah. Got to put away some dialogue. But yeah, it's I'm the Baffler, Harper's, Atlantic. My wife gave me rebuilt and regrooved my sauna for my birthday. So I do a schwitz every 3 days a week, and I can't bring a Kindle in there. So it's I have a stack of the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, despite the fact that it's tainted by the presence of Spiegelman and his wife. And I'm just look, when that kerfuffle started about Spiegelman's book being banned or
dropped from a curriculum
from the curriculum at the school, I pointed out the fact that as much as I loathe him on a personal basis, and I find the book a self-serving piece of shit, nobody should be doing this to him. He doesn't deserve it. And I reiterated by saying that there is no circumstance under anything I can imagine doing the same thing for me. But I don't live in a world of quid pro quo. I have my own sense of values, and fuck you if you don't like it.
Yeah. It's a good note to leave off on.
The end.
And that was Howard Chaykin. His upcoming book is the Time Squared Omnibus, coming from Image Comics in August. Time Squared is time and the number 2 squared. That's the visual pun thing. I should have mentioned that at the beginning. Anyway, if you haven't read the first 2 Time Squared stories from the 1980s, you're going to plot when you see what Howard was doing back then and how comics are still sort of catching up with what he did. If you have read them, the new edition probably looks a lot better than whatever condition your old first graphic novels are in. And this one's got the conclusion to Time Squared, along with all sorts of great supporting and archival material. So go pre-order the Time Squared Omnibus from Image Comics. Now, Howard's other recent work includes the series Hey Kids, Comics, and Divided States of Hysteria, also both from Image. I've read 1.5 series of Hey Kids comics. It's great. I just need to have my contacts out when I read this stuff because I'm an old man now and I can't focus on a comic book page when my contacts are in. Anyway, it's really fascinating stuff and shows a lot of understanding of Howard's the history of the comics industry and what Howard got to witness firsthand. Now, Howard is on Instagram as Howard Victor Chaykin, but he hasn't posted there in years. Still, it's a fun way to check out his art. And his website is Howard Chaykin Art, and he does an occasional email at howardchaykinsubstack.com. His most recent one was on Father's Day, and that was an absolute goddamn knockout. Made me feel a lot better about anything I had as far as father issues. But anyway, I'll have links to all this stuff in the show and episode notes for this one. And you can support this podcast by telling other people about it. Let them know there's this podcast comes out every week with interesting conversations with fascinating people. And you can also support the show by contacting me, letting me know what you like and don't like about it and who you'd like to hear me record with or what movie or TV show or book or piece of music or art exhibition or piece of musical theater you think I should turn listeners on to. And you can do that by email, DM, postcard, I love postcards, letter, or by leaving me a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about me picking up and getting stuck in an awkward conversation. And messages can only be up to 3 minutes long. So if you're going to go super long, call back, leave another message, and let me know if it's cool to use your message in an upcoming episode of the show. Sometimes you might have something that would make a neat segment for listeners, but I would never run something like that without the speaker's approval and permission. So let me know. Now, if you've got money or other resources to spare, don't give it to me. I mean, I always appreciate it, but my day job treats me fine. The expenses for this particular episode, you could say, were immense, but it was really just part of my taking a couple of days in LA and getting away before this business trip to San Diego. So if you have money or resources to spare, give to individuals and institutions in real need. You can find people through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Topato Go, and other crowdfunding platforms. And if you're looking for somewhere to start with institutions or foundations, I give to my local food bank every month. I occasionally give to the Poor People's Campaign, but there are all sorts of other sources you can donate to. Planned Parenthood and other women's choice related funds could probably use a lot of help right now, but freedom funds, election funds, there's an awful lot of things you can do to help build a better world. So I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth. used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/May4th. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.